Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Centre for Policy Studies panel. My name is Tom Clockerty. I'm Head of Tax at the CPS, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's discussion. We do seem to be kicking off at peak trolley time outside, so if you hear some loud wheels rattling past, don't be disconcerted. That is the one downside of this otherwise absolutely wonderful space that we've got here. Hopefully things will quieten down. We're here to discuss whether it's time to turn off the taps, tax, spending, and the inflation threat. And I think we've got a great panel to discuss this. We're going to be hearing from James Hayward, who is my colleague, Head of Welfare and Opportunity at the Centre for Policy Studies. In a change to the previously advertised programme, we're going to be hearing from Carsten Jung, who is a senior economist at the IPPR and previously spent 6 years with the Bank of England. I'm not sure that he is a like-for-like replacement for our previous speaker, Julie Marsden, but nevertheless, it's great for him to join us, and hopefully a little bit of ideological diversity on the panel will make this a fun discussion. And then finally, sitting to my right, we'll have Jessie Norman, who is the Member of Parliament for Hereford and South Herefordshire, and of course very relevantly to this discussion, from 2019 to 2021, he was Financial Secretary to the Treasury with significant responsibility for the UK tax system. And so, of course, we hope that he can give us some governmental insight, but also speak with the freedom that he has now acquired. And so we're looking forward to that. Our format is basically going to be some short introductory remarks from each speaker. We'll have some further discussion here among the panelists and then open it up to questions, either from those of you in the room or from anyone who happens to be watching virtually as well. So I suppose without further ado, let me hand over to James Hayward.
Thank you very much, Tom. And yeah, it's been a very interesting last year or so for those of us interested in this sort of a topic, and we were just discussing actually before the panel. I think it's fair to say a lot of things have happened to both the world economy, the UK economy, and in the world of public finances that a lot of people didn't expect could happen. So it's going to be an interesting discussion. I think I would start by sort of addressing the issue of where we are in terms of the public finances, and specifically what the pandemic has meant for the kind of the fiscal balance sheet. I'd say there's probably two main impacts from the last year or so that are important to sort of address in the discussion. One is the fact that we obviously will now have a massively increased stock of public debt. The huge emergency spending that was needed over the course of the pandemic has put public debt up by possibly around 20 percentage points as a proportion of GDP. And that does mean that we will have increased exposure to changes in interest rates as well as changes in inflation. But I wouldn't overdo those, and I think that it is possible to do that. Interest rates are extremely low at the moment, and it would be silly not to be taking advantage of that as long as that's being done in ways that are beneficial for the economy, particularly in terms of capital investments. I think the other important thing going forward is going to be the fact that we are going to have a smaller economy. The big question is going to be how much smaller. Some sort of interesting numbers to note. I suspect, considering all of the a lot of the commentary at the moment is about tax rises to fund big spending increases and how this is a big tax and big spend government. If you actually look, and I mean, these numbers don't take into account the recent social care levy change, but if you look at the last Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts from spring, you would actually see that despite the fact that the Chancellor's budget included some major tax rises, specifically on corporation tax, they are forecasting that tax revenue would be £40 billion lower than they were forecasting a year earlier before the pandemic. So despite higher tax rates, revenue is still expected to be substantially lower. And that's slightly offset by £8 billion lower spending. There's two things to say there. One is that those economic forecasts are likely to be upgraded substantially over the coming months, and the Chancellor may find he's got more money to play with. But the flip side of that is that the Chancellor's spending plans at the moment are incredibly stingy, to the extent that I suspect most people in the public policy world would say that they are probably undeliverable. The fact that he put spending up so much during the pandemic was sort of used to mask the fact that large amounts of money were taken out of departmental spending limits. And I think it's fair to say that most people don't expect that after the pandemic we can be spending less in real terms than we were. In particular, for example, there are currently no real terms increases in NHS spending penciled in. I suspect that the reason for that is because when the election comes up, the Chancellor wants to be able to say that he's putting more money into the system. And I also suspect that that is why we are seeing a lot of talk about tax rises now, because in a sense the stinginess on the spending and the going heavy on the tax rises is being front-loaded, possibly for electoral reasons, which is not necessarily the best way to manage public finances or the economy. But I wouldn't be surprised, therefore, in answer to the question of whether we should be expecting lots more tax rises down the line, that as we approach the election, we will probably start to see some loosening. And the reason that they're being so sort of fiscally conservative right now is that they're hoping that they can start to look a bit more generous when the election comes up. So that's my kind of opening thoughts, and I'll hand over to the other panelists.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, James. Carsten, over to you.
Thanks very much. I in fact, agree with a lot of James's points. In my opening remarks, I think I'd like to stress three aspects of the sort of macroeconomic and spending situation. First, the hard winter ahead. Second, the question of inflation. And thirdly, the problem of low medium-term growth, which is a really big problem and my most important point, I think. But starting with the hard winter ahead, there's been surprisingly little discussion by Rishi Sunak in his speech yesterday of the cost of living crisis and measures that could be taken to help people through this. And that's, of course, at the same time as the universal credit uplift is taking £20 out of people's pockets per week, out of people's pockets that are on universal credit. So just as a reminder, 4 million families rely on universal credit, and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation estimates that the end to the uplift will push 500,000 people into poverty. So this is the immediate challenge we're facing this winter, and that's one example of where in the spending review we should be hoping that there is more support coming for people. This is also at a time where the VAT cut for hospitality has been reversed, and of course the furlough scheme is ending. So we are faced with a very difficult winter, and more fiscal support just to address those immediate needs would be important. Also important to highlight that the economy is not yet out of the woods. So Q2 GDP was 3.5% below pre-crisis levels. The Bank of England actually has said that they has downgraded their outlook for growth, both for this year but also for next year. They were surprised how slowly the labor market has evolved. So fewer people have come off the furlough scheme than the Bank of England expected. So all of this is just to say we are not out of the woods, and fiscal support has been supporting the economy, and that is now all taken away in one go at the same time as we're facing a cost of living crisis. So more would need to be done. Now my second point on inflation. In August, annualized inflation has gone above 3%. The Bank of England expects it to reach 4%. So that is, a big part of the cost of living crisis. It is driven by energy prices and by supply bottlenecks in some areas. But and they will persist. So this is not something that will go away in the next month or so. So the Bank of England thinks we will go into 2022 with 4% inflation. So that's, we shouldn't gloss over that. That's a big deal. And it's, again, part of the reason why we need to continue support low-income families. But most analysts in financial markets think that these supply bottlenecks will ease over the next year. And so you had a jump in energy costs, but again, people don't expect it to jump again and again, right? So in fact, the prices may come down again as the gas supply ramps up. So financial markets think these pressures will go down over the next months, and so the forward rates for inflation, and so the bets that the financial sector makes on inflation are actually such that they're not too worried about it. So therefore I wouldn't overemphasize the risk of high inflation. But that said, that we need policies to address the fallout of inflation. And of course, the Bank of England will have to probably tighten monetary policy slightly sooner, possibly, than we'd previously thought. But all in all, and I think most people in the financial sector you speak to would agree, there is no reason to panic. And there is, in fact, a risk that if we panic and tighten policy, it will actually do more harm than good. So that's second on inflation. And finally, the point on medium-term growth. So in 2023, the Bank of England thinks the UK will only grow at slightly above 1% of GDP. So that's below the expectations pre-pandemic. So even though we have a quick bounce back at the moment that we're seeing, actually medium-term growth is really poor. And it's unclear where that growth is going to come from. Business investment is still below crisis levels. The super deduction hasn't actually translated into a big increase in business investment. So there's a big question of how we can raise medium-term growth. And we've argued that public investment is a catalyst for private sector growth. The IMF estimates that for every pound the public sector invests, there are 6 pounds of private sector investment. And so Rishi Sunak has the opportunity to increase public investment above the level of 3% of GDP that he's envisaged. And we argue he should go to 5%. Which is about the level of Sweden, and that could really bolster medium-term growth, and it could also provide a more balanced jobs recovery, and maybe we can go into that a bit more in the discussion. So address the cost of living crisis through further support, inflation, don't panic about it, and third, boost medium-term growth through public investment in green and social infrastructure.
Thank you, Carsten. Jesse, I imagine quite a lot in those previous two sets of remarks for you to reflect on and respond to. Obviously, we're very eager to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to the CPS. What should we say? It feels like we're in emergency ward 10 with all the trolleys being kind of wheeled around us. So thank you for putting up with that, and thanks for having me. Well, what to say? There's a whole, I mean, you will appreciate that having very recently just stepped down as a Treasury Minister, I hope you won't mind, I'm not going to open the kimono of Horse Guards Road and reveal any secrets. not least because we've got a budget coming in 4 weeks' time, and I've been quite heavily involved in most of the tax planning for that, and it would be hopelessly wrong to discuss that now. So let me just, if I may, make some general comments and then pick up a couple of points that have been raised by the other speakers. The first is just to inject, and you would expect this away from me, a more of a historical perspective. You will recall, ladies and gentlemen, that it was the settled policy of governments, Tory and Labour, until 2007-8, that national debt should not exceed 40% of GDP. That was Gordon Brown's target, 40% of GDP. So we're at 99.5 or whatever it is % now. And perhaps that's a useful way of just catalyzing in our own minds what the problem is, right? It's a very simple problem, which is that we're massively over-leveraged by any historical norm. And it would be entirely wrong for me to make the party political comment that the reason for that was the extremely light touch approach that the Labour Party took to bank debt, which exploded from 20 times equity to 50 times in 7 years between 2000 and 2007. So when the financial crisis of 2007 struck, it just exploded the commercial banking sector, and the end of that, of course, was nationalizations, public debt, and an explosion in our debt to GDP ratio. So that's the context. So looking at 99.5% debt to GDP is not a pretty or a beautiful thing. And to come into that in the aftermath of a pandemic, and let us not pretend that there is not still, the after effects of pandemic are not still very much with us, is I think, quite a sobering thought. Now, it is true that interest rates are at a extraordinary low and remain as such. But of course, that in itself disguises the fact that the structure of interest rates has changed somewhat. Now, we have always done, we did very well in 2007-8, and we have done well recently because the term structure of UK debt was very long, much longer than any other developed country, broadly speaking. But the effect of monetary operations over the last few years has been to push our vulnerability to changes at the short end of the yield curve up significantly. So small changes in interest rates have potentially large effects on the public finances in, as it were, real time. And that's something we have to be very, very careful about. At the same time, again, with a historical perspective, we were looking at a point where there was a 25% reduction in GDP as a result of the pandemic. And everyone expected it to bounce back. But to bounce back to what you might call a running loss of 3.5%, which is where Carsten's correctly said we look like we're on the consensus forecast for coming out, is actually, I hope you won't mind me saying so, I was there at the time, pretty miraculous. No one expected us to do that well, and I don't think anyone has expected us, fingers crossed, subject to the usual caveats, holding ourselves in all the good luck ways, clutching our lucky charms and our rabbit's feet, etc., to emerge where we have done on the employment side either, where employment was roughly figured to be 4 or 5 times unemployment as a result of the pandemic, to be roughly 4 or 5 times where we think it will be. So that's all, as it were, by way of background and a note on our sensitivity to changes in interest rates. It does mean that we have to be a little bit more sensitive about borrowing because we're that much more at risk if some of the wider macro monetary conditions start to change. A couple of other things just to point out, if I may. This being a CPS group event, I hope you mind if I take the conversation on a little bit. So it also had an effect, the pandemic, on the tax system, and this is quite important. So, for example, we've spent a long time, no one really knows this because it's deep in the bowels of the Treasury, we've spent the last couple of years with HMRC and Treasury thinking very hard about how to work with businesses and with individuals who have acquired tax debt as a result of the pandemic, because we've given so many rollovers, and we've had to put in place emergency measures to allow people to pay off those debts in a structured and sensible way. That's a very important subordinate change. What does that tend to? What it reminds us is that it's really important not just to protect what to think about what the current fiscal impact is, but what the impacts on the tax system as a whole are, and also what the impacts are on what you might call norms. People pay tax by and large because they understand the rules and they're trusting people, they comply by the rules, and they think they get caught out if they don't. If those norms ever changed, I can tell you the effect of that would be considerably more than £40 billion a year, which in the face of a pandemic is actually a remarkably sanguine forecast. So keeping those norms in place is really important. It's not quite true, I'm afraid, as Carsten said, that support has been entirely taken away at one time. You know, Chancellor's announced an enormous range of new things. There are various parts of the existing schemes which run over. But it has been important, I think, to the government to mark a point at which, as it were, the economy is being nudged and pressed back towards something that equates to a new normality, because we simply don't feel, and I'm sure the good folks at the CPS and the Conservative Conference, if they are Conservatives, would believe that we could continue to live on anything like the kind of free-spending state, open-handed state way that we have done, which was appropriate in the pandemic, but which would never be contemplated in peacetime. So that's the other context. A couple of other things. So because we're nervous about, we have been nervous about, and the bank has been nervous, although it's a kind of, its forecasts are, I think, relatively optimistic and confident. There is a concern, obviously, that interest rates might have to go up at some point. There is a lingering discussion about stagflation in the world economy. I don't necessarily think that's justified, frankly. I think what we're seeing at the moment is the world economy massively bouncing back from the pandemic. That's why gas prices, why raw materials prices have spiked as they have done. But one has to be aware of the inflation threat. That's an important aspect of government policy. Final point on growth. Listen, we have set out plans. I was responsible for national infrastructure strategy as well as HMRC when I was at the Treasury, and we have set out plans for £600 billion worth of investment, half it public, half it private, over the next few years. We are really investing heavily in capital infrastructure. Now, there's a really interesting question, which is infrastructure obviously is valuable for levelling up. It's not as valuable as skills. Skills are the most valuable thing you can improve if you want to enhance levelling up, but it's obviously an important aspect of things. I'm not at all persuaded that increasing marginal public investment would make as much of a difference as Carsten suggests. I'm not sure we have the absorptive capacity to make that investment within the supply chains that are already in place, and therefore you might get inflation in the supply chains as a result of that. I would be interested to hear from Carsten how he proposed to pay for it. But always an interesting question to the CPS audience. Let me leave you with one final thought, which is one little thing that we did do, which I was very proud of and pleased about, which I think will be potentially quite useful in the longer term in thinking about growth and productivity improvement, is to set up the UK Infrastructure Bank. And it's not an enormous institution. It's got about £22 billion of initial firepower, although that might grow in time as we put it onto a statutory basis. But it will act as a reservoir of expertise and talent right at that cutting edge of some of these new technologies, and therefore not in the old style addressing issues of market failure, but addressing issues of emerging market possibility, which I think is extremely interesting in areas such as hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, as it were, localized energy sources, and the rest of it. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Jesse, thank you very much. I think one thing I want to pick up straight away from everybody's remarks really is the centrality of economic growth to the challenge that we face. There aren't many panaceas in public policy, but actually an economy that grows faster than you expect or faster than it has done historically really makes a lot of other problems go away. The challenge, of course, is how can you as a policymaker affect growth rates? And Carsten obviously has made the point about public investment, and I'll give you a chance to come back on what Jesse just said there. But I did want to first give James and Jesse just a chance to maybe expand on that point. What can and should the government be doing to boost our growth prospects? And James, if I can turn to you first.
Well, Carsten mentioned the super deduction, and I think obviously the super deduction in some ways is a welcome policy because we do have a tax system in the UK that is particularly mean to companies that invest a lot in their plant and machinery. But the problem with the policy is that it is a temporary policy. And the whole point of the policy was to try to get companies to front load their investment plans. But actually what matters for our long-term growth prospects is the long-term cost of capital. And from a company's perspective, yes, they've got the temporary super deduction right now, but when you're looking at the UK as a place to invest over the coming years and decades, super deduction runs out in 2023, at which point we go back to, on current plans, having an even less generous investment allowance system than we had pre-pandemic. And we're going to have a substantially higher rate of corporation tax. So, I mean, that's an obvious area that I would point to as, if we want to be encouraging companies to invest in the UK, then we need to be looking at ways to incentivise that through the tax system.
And Jesse, I mean, I think it's fair to say that growth is not really a new problem in any way. I mean, probably going back to the whole post-financial crisis era, the UK economy has sort of consistently underperformed forecasts. And we certainly haven't had the sort of productivity growth that we've expected. To put it bluntly, we're really not as rich 10 years on, or however long it is, as we anticipated being. Your perspective, both as a Member of Parliament and from within government, how much are you focused on that as politicians and as a government? Or, I suppose in a way, and I hope this isn't unfair, does the Treasury tend to feel that growth is something that happens to it and it responds to, rather than being something where it can really drive a positive agenda?
Well, no, thank you for the question. So I think it is true that growth has been, quite, it's been steady, but it has not been as high as I think anyone in government would have liked. And actually, there's no clear analysis for exactly why that is. Obviously linked very much to productivity. There isn't a really clear analysis to why productivity is lower than expected or than it should be. Part of the story appears to be about automation. If you think about some of the stuff that the UK has been doing in terms of raising minimum wage rates and living wage rates, a lot of that's about wage compression and a little nudge at the margin to companies to invest more in automation and machinery. The super deduction is the same thing. It's an attempt to kind of provide a bit of an electric jolt to the 100-odd billion quid that's sitting in corporate balance sheets that could go into machinery as well. If you think about what the long-term sources of growth are going to be in the UK, there's no magic formula, right? It's always the same thing, right? Highly competitive markets full of entrepreneurs, able to set up businesses and then grow them. And in the UK, we have tended, in part because of the financialization of our economy, to have a more short-term approach and a more cash-out approach than perhaps we should have done. I mean, the joke I always like is, that the American says, well, my first business was worth $10 million, my next one will be worth $100 million. The German says, well, my first business is worth 10 million euros, and when my grandchildren inherit it, it'll be worth 100 million euros. And the Brit says, my business is worth 2 billion pounds, I'm selling up and going to live in Gloucestershire. And, it's not very, it captures the truth. Famously described by Martin Wiener as the decline of the English industrial spirit. And this is not the buccaneering, investing, markets-based, as it were, energizing spirit that we sometimes think of. And we need to find a way of recapturing that and rebottling it. And actually, I do see lots of areas where we could be doing that, and we are doing it. And one of the things that's quite interesting is the question of what a 21st century value-added manufacturing and services industrial strategy will look like. Now, the government seems to have moved slightly away from the industrial strategy that it inherited from Theresa May, but actually, if you look at the activity, an awful lot of the activity is precisely focused on that value-added manufacturing and services space. As regards me, look, you're the last person. I'm the last person on planet you ought to be asking about growth. I'm trying to build a university that's going to dramatically revolutionize the growth in Herefordshire for the next 1,000 years. So I'm very focused on that indeed. Within the Treasury, I don't think the Treasury is a passive recipient of growth. I think it thinks a lot about growth. What it really does need, though, is clients in government, other departments that are really focused on getting the ball over the line and can work with the Treasury so that the public finances are supporting and in sync with that. And I think, obviously the Chancellor is very, very keen to push up growth for all the reasons you've described: higher growth, higher tax revenues, lower tax rates, more entrepreneurship, more energy, better economic regeneration. So I think the incentives are very clear.
Okay, thank you. And Carsten, I said I'd give you a chance to respond to Jesse's challenge in his opening remarks. And I mean, I know that you won't be shocked to find yourself being challenged on the idea of public investment being the driver of growth at the Conservative Party conference. And so feel free to respond as you want to that. But just the particular challenges that I think would be interesting. Obviously, there's the question of how you pay for it. But perhaps even more than that is how do you, if we accept the theory that public investment can drive up growth, how do we make sure that we actually do the right kind of public spending and that we can actually deliver the sort of sums that you and your colleagues at the IPPR are talking about? Because, I mean, certainly the perception, and I think it's fairly well-founded, is that we tend not to be very good at big projects in this country, that we don't spend on the right things, that we tend to be wasteful, and so on, and that lies behind a lot of the Conservative reticence about public investment.
Great, really great questions. Maybe an interesting anecdote. Before I was at the Bank of England, I worked at the International Monetary Fund, which is, the beacon of fiscal rectitude. In the 90s, they were really strong on making countries tighten their belts. Obviously, assistance to the UK as well. And it's quite spectacular how they've changed their minds on public investment. So they've gone from very, emphasizing balanced budgets to now emphasizing the need for public investment to drive growth. And their argument is that it can actually be good for public finances. So right on the question of how do we pay for it? So the argument is basically that through public investment, you generate high returns for the private sector by improving infrastructure, improving skills, improving your education system, say, and that increases the economy more quickly than it increases the debt stock. So it's just quite remarkable to see that even sort of conservative economists really emphasize the need to ramp up public investment, and the IMF has actually highlighted that the UK is not investing enough. It's a fairly mainstream view now, and it's also just important to highlight the issue of low interest rates. We can't talk about the economy and growth in a low interest rate world in the same way as if we were in a high interest rate world. So low interest rates change everything. So basically we're in a situation for a decade, financial markets have paid the government money in real terms to take their money. Okay, so even if the returns on investment aren't that high, it would still be economically and financially efficient to borrow money to invest. So just to emphasize, low interest rates, which we've had for a decade, change everything. That's not to say that couldn't change. So the interest rate sensitivity point is a really important one. But that gets us to the question of high quality investment, making sure that public spending is done in a high quality way so it actually increases growth rather than being sort of wasteful. And I think a good example of what the problem is, and I think it's a really important question of how do we make investment effective, is the Green Homes grant that the government gave offered to households in the pandemic, and we would count home improvements as efficiency enhancing and thus as investment. So it was offered, up to £5,000 to, improve your home in terms of energy efficiency, but almost nobody used it. And the reason was not that consumers didn't want it, but the supply chains weren't there. So actually very few businesses applied to become delivery partners for home improvements. So this highlights that we can't just dole money out and everything will be fine. I completely agree. We need to ensure that the supply chains are there and that the skills are there. And a lot of public investment should go into improving this type of infrastructure, supply chains and skills and education, because otherwise there is a risk that the investment won't be used and growth won't be forthcoming. And then finally, on sort of the quality of investment, actually the UK has a fairly strong, by international comparison, framework for public investment. So, international organizations like the OECD or the IMF actually highlight us as an example for transparency. That doesn't mean that there's cost overruns and that it can be improved, but actually on various measures of effectiveness, we are doing actually pretty well, and we should double down on that.
Okay. I've got further questions myself, but I think it's probably time that I open it up to the audience and gather some of your thoughts. So, hands, please. All right. The gentleman in the white shirt by the television first.
Thank you. Just a couple of points. Jesse Norman raised, to me, the most interesting statistic of the morning, which is that the public debt is now 99.5%. And I've heard nothing really which makes me feel it's ever going to come down. And if you look at the performance of our government over the last 11 years, we used to have people like Mr. Osborne and Mr. Cameron talking about paying down the deficit, which to me was utterly disingenuous language, because the deficit was there every year, and it may have been shrinking a bit, but actually all that meant was the growth in that stock of debt was growing a little bit more slowly. Now, I'm of an age where I'm not going to be paying this back, but there's quite a few people in this room who are of an age that will be paying it back. And I find it absolutely terrifying for them. And unless there's starting to be a return to surpluses on an annual basis, we're never going to be in a position to make the necessary policy responses to things like the financial crisis at 2008, which ramped up the debt from 40 to 60 or whatever it was, and then last year's pandemic, which necessitated, as you say, doing whatever it took to save lives and protect the livelihoods. What happens next time when there's something like that comes along? There is absolutely no scope now for us to step in and help people.
Thank you. Jesse, I wonder if I can come to you first on that. A really great question, by the way. And I mean, I think the two things that we can really pick out of that, there's the intergenerational fairness element of government borrowing and sort of shifting the bill onto future generations. And then also that point, if we don't fix the roof while the sun is shining, I think someone used to say that around here, how do we deal with the next big crisis?
Well, I thank General very much for the question. I'm very glad he picked up the point I made about the statistic. I think there's a little technical point, which is that when the Cameron-Osborne government was talking about reducing the deficit, this was the cyclically adjusted deficit across the cycle. So it was the extra bit over and above the bit you might be expected to spend through the cycle, i.e. the discretionary bit, if you like. And I think that's just a word of defence in their name. I don't think it was disingenuous to want to do that. That was a problem about government profligacy in a way which they were trying to address, or a government spending they were trying to spend. Now, on the issue of surpluses, I think there's a very long-term problem here. I don't think anyone has really focused on what the long-term solution to an economy. We do know that every time everyone thinks we can't do something, we then go and do it. So it's not absolutely quite clear the problem is as large as we think, but it's very hard to see how we could have a crisis of the same scale that we've just had. If we're entering a pandemic kind of world, then what would happen? We'd have to have incredible resources, both in terms of public health reaction and also in terms of the public finances, in order to be able to deal with it. I think that's. I don't think anyone has really come up with a satisfactory answer to that question. I think there does seem to be a kind of vague hope that the problem will eventually just inflate itself away, but which is kind of the British solution, but that's hardly a solution that anyone in this room would want to support or accept.
James, I mean, you are as much of a fiscal conservative as anyone I know. Has this pandemic and the explosion in debt changed your views at all, or has it sort of made you feel, and sort of in connection with the gentleman's question, that we really need to double down and deal with this issue?
Well, I think the important thing to bear in mind, well, firstly, on what the gentleman said, yes, it's true that technically we have not been at any point running surpluses, although it is true that we did manage to stabilise the debt to GDP ratio. Actually, the government did, for a number of years, successfully eliminate the current budget deficit. So we were in a situation where we were only borrowing to invest, and it looks like the Chancellor is going to aim for a set of fiscal rules which will mean that he wants to eliminate the current budget deficit again, but continue to borrow to invest. But it is worth saying that it is possible to deliver a gradually falling, only slightly, but gradually falling debt to GDP ratio, whilst still running a deficit on overall spending. The important thing, I think, is that the Chancellor will want to rightly stabilise the debt to GDP ratio as quickly as possible. Yes, it's true, as I said in my opening remarks, that we will have an inflated stock of debt, and we shouldn't be blind to the increased exposure that means we will have. But while it is true we don't want to be sort of piling excessive debts onto future generations, I also don't think that future generations will thank us for leaving them with creaking public services or a stagnant economy.
Jesse, you want?
I mean, there's a very small just follow-up point which actually picks that up very well, which is it kind of depends what you spend the money on, right? If you're spending money on essentially current consumption or something like it, then you have a lot of debt with potentially modest amounts over it. If you spend it on infrastructure or long-term capital-type projects, even potentially skills improvement, you have an asset to carry forward for future generations as well as the debt you're carrying forward. It's quite important to make that distinction, I think, as well.
All right. Just quickly, Carsten, and then after that, I'll ask for a general show of hands who's got a question burning in the back of their mind so I can gauge how quickly we need to rattle through them over the next 20 minutes or so. But Carsten, if you go quickly.
Just very quickly to remind people, so the debt stock is now 100% of GDP, so that's a debt over the size of the economy. But after World War II in the UK it was 250%, so this is not unprecedented. We had much higher levels, and we brought it down, right? We brought it down to about 60%. And how did we do that? It wasn't through surpluses. It was exactly through what James said, through growth. So if you have a growing economy, then relative to the size of the economy, your debt shrinks. And that's, even without surpluses, a way to reduce the debt burden is to have a fast-growing economy. So after World War II, the economy was booming. And if we can replicate that through public investment and private sector investment, then the debt burden will shrink.
Okay. General sense of how many questions we're going to have. Okay. So I saw Gerard Lyons first, and then we'll go to the chap there, please. And I saw you, so don't worry.
Thank you, Gerard Lyons, The Economist. Thanks for a great series of presentations. If I may, two questions. One to Jesse. Jesse, you mentioned banks in the context of 2002 to 2007, but in the context of a growth strategy, do you think banks should be or can be encouraged to do more to lend to the real economy, particularly small firms? And the second question, if I may, James mentioned exposure to inflation and Carsten talked about monetary policy. Globally, not just in the UK, central banks have bloated balance sheets and have engaged in, shall we say, unconventional monetary policy. When we emerge from this, James and Carsten, what do you think should be the implication for the remit of the Bank of England, or indeed the issue about the independence of the Bank of England? Thank you.
All right, yeah, great questions. Jesse, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, fabulous question, Jerry. Thank you for that. I would say, listen, if you want a really frightening experience, ladies and gentlemen, let me invite you to look at the composition of the balance sheets of the commercial banks and ask yourself, what is the function of a bank and how well are these institutions discharging that function? Because I put it to you, the function of a bank is to lend money to people and businesses who need it in order to live their lives and create growth and prosperity. And yet, if you look at the bank balance sheets, you will find that less than 5% of their assets go on corporate lending. Now, just think about that for a second. It's astonishing. Lots of mortgages, but very, very little actual lending to people with businesses who would like that money in order to grow and succeed. That's a serious, serious problem. Now, you don't have to go to the excesses of the Sparkassenbank or the Landesbanken in Germany, which have a mixed record in terms of financial viability over the years, to think there's a lot more we could be doing in that area. So I completely agree with the premise behind that. But I also think that there are other things that banks could be doing, and they could be leaning much more into the question of how we grow smaller businesses, how we fill that gap with different financial instruments which allow smaller businesses to grow and to develop. And I think that's an area, it requires them to develop skills of credit assessment and business assessment that actually in many ways have dropped out of the picture. So it would require a remarkable change in the nature of those institutions. But I think, in my own personal view, a wholly salutary one, both for them and for the UK economy.
Carsten, I think maybe with your experience at the Bank of England, the question of the monetary remit is a good one to pose to you. Do you see changes in the UK or indeed elsewhere around the world, given the state of central bank balance sheets and the general economic picture?
Sure. I think what the crisis, the pandemic has reminded us of is that monetary policy and what the Bank of England does has huge implications for what the government can do. So if the Bank of England decided to sell all the bonds, the government bonds that they bought, in one go, then that it would be difficult for the government possibly to borrow new money. So there is a delicate interplay, and it's kind of always been there. So I'm not sure if really there is now more than before the pandemic we have a reason to change the remit. But that said, I think there is a case for scrutiny, public scrutiny. The Bank of England has their main remit is to focus on inflation, about 2%, and a secondary remit is to support the government's policies. And that includes, in the pandemic, stabilizing gilt markets so the government could borrow without disruption. And so I think it's still right for the central bank to focus on the inflation remit, but perhaps there needs to be a bit more of public scrutiny of that secondary remit, namely is it doing too much or too little to support government policy? And for example, in the US, for example, there is more emphasis on supporting government policy and less emphasis, relatively less emphasis on the inflation target. So you can overshoot inflation if it helps government policy. And I think there's an interesting debate to be had. I'm actually not sure where I stand on this. But I think the public should be more aware, because so far it's been a fairly technocratic discussion and it's really important for society. So let's have that debate.
Yeah, James, did you want to add anything there?
So I think really one of the important things over the next year or two is going to be actually reassuring markets that the Bank of England is truly independent. The problem that we've got now, as Carsten alluded to, is that a huge amount of the government's debt pile is now held by the Bank of England. And obviously that means that it's great for the government in some ways, in that it means that they're paying bank rate, and bank rate is historically low. It does obviously also mean that if rates go up, then the government is exposed to that. But it also means that the government needs to be doing everything it can, and the bank needs to be doing everything they can to make sure that people are reassured that this experiment that we've been having over the last nearly quarter century now in bank independence is working, and that the bank's truly independent. But I also think on the inflation point, ultimately, from the government's perspective, the government will want to make sure that inflation is under control, partly because of the impact that a rise in inflation could have on its debt stock, but also actually talked about less is the impact that a rise in inflation can have on day-to-day spending. In the budget earlier this year, the Chancellor managed to save £4 billion on his spending plans purely because at that time there was a downgrade or there was a reduction in the inflation forecast. And because the Chancellor's spending commitments are made in terms of real-term spending increases, the Chancellor says, in the next financial year, I'm going to increase this department's budget by 2% in real terms. If inflation goes up, then that is an immediate increase in the government's spending commitments. So it's very much going to be in the government's interest to make sure that the bank is as focused as possible on keeping inflation under control.
I'll just add a very quick plug before we move to the next question for a report that James and I both worked on with Sajid Javid. I'll stress while he was on the back benches and not a member of the cabinet, but it was called After the Virus. We may have copies at the back, I'm not sure. One chunky section of that report was really looking at the case for shifting from inflation targeting to nominal GDP targeting. It's probably too big and complicated a topic to jump straight into here, and I don't want to take time away from other people's questions, but if this is an area that anyone's interested in, I'd encourage you to have a quick look at that. The sort of spoiler alert short version is that we think that inflation targeting has been effective in the past, but there are certain deficiencies, and that a revised remit may lead to better outcomes. I mean, basically, if you have inflation because the wind isn't blowing and energy prices are going up, or there's a shortage of people to drive HGVs, is that really a sign that the Bank of England needs to change its monetary policy? Probably not, and they know that, of course, but that there may be other targets which lead to better monetary policy outcomes. Anyway, enough of me waffling. The chat there, and then I think I might double up with the questions and go across the aisle to you as well, please.
Thank you. So just a framing question, really, but coming out of the pandemic and the aftermath of that and the contraction the economy suffered, are we not just for the first time in modern history confronting the embedded growth problem, right? So we spend more, we borrow more based on future promises of growth, and so we expect productivity to come for that, to pay for what we borrowed yesterday, but it's not happening for us in the way we would like it to, in the macroeconomic environment we're in, but just also the British economy, the business economy, is just not structured in the way it was post-World War II. We don't have that same level of innovation. We're not building things. So are we not just facing that problem for the first time? And I don't see us generate any new solutions other than do the same thing we've always done, spend more and hopefully get more growth, whatever that is.
That's a really good question. There you go, yep.
Hi, thank you. Just want to bring it back to intergenerational fairness and probably direct this at Jesse Norman. So I'm 26 years old and my marginal rate of tax, thanks to student loans, is above 50%, which has gone up even more thanks to the national insurance rise. And there's hundreds of thousands of professionals like me in a similar position. So does it not fill the Conservatives with terror at the prospect of, in 15 years' time, when we're in our 40s and we're going to become your kind of main voter base, that we stop believing that you're the party of low tax for the middle classes?
I mean, maybe, Jess, if you want to respond to that first, and then we'll come to this bigger question about, I guess, what we could call secular stagnation and whether we're really grappling with it for the first time. I mean, I think it's a fair point. We want younger people to vote Conservative or become Conservatives, but if we're taxing them that heavily early in their career, perhaps where money is tight anyway, we're not really sending the right message.
I'm perfectly happy to come to this question much later on if you want, Chair. Listen, thank you very much indeed for the question. And I understand the way it presents itself to someone who's in that position now. And I don't think it's an adequate answer, by the way, for a Conservative Party to say, well, look, the other guys are going to tax you more than we will and they're going to destroy your livelihoods more. I don't think that's an adequate. We've got to give people a positive reason for thinking there's something really important going on. And I think the first place to think of it at the start, I think, is not just to focus on the time slice that's one particular moment, which is extremely seductive to do. It's to ask oneself, what is the arc of one's own life and how well can one live that? And actually, what's really interesting is that if you say to someone, look, knowing what you know, is there another place or another time when you'd rather have been born? It's a remarkably hard question to answer. And the famous example, as you will know, is Amschel. I think it was Meyer Rothschild, Amschel Rothschild, who died in whatever it was, 1848, of a tooth abscess, which spread, and he would have been saved with, £5 worth of antibiotics. He was the richest man in the world. Okay, at a young age. This is really just by way of saying, what are you paying for? The answer is you're paying for hopefully a good education. You're paying for the possibility of growing up in a country where I'd like to think public services will have recovered successfully and effectively from the pandemic. And I'd like to think that the norms of the tax and benefit system, the economic system, are ones that allow you to aspire and to build and succeed in your own terms. And by the way, you'll live longer than any previous generation, and hopefully you'll have a longer period of healthy life than any previous generation, and you'll enjoy technological and other opportunities which, until partly the last 2 years, are greater than any previous generation would have had. So I hope you won't feel that stuff isn't attractive and valuable and important. But I can't pretend it is easy for people. And of course, if one goes back and just, as it were, compares it with people of my generation, where a very small number of people went to university and, they received a bit of grant, even if they were, not, even the Duke of Westminster would have received some grant, at university at that time. They're not unreasonably going to say, well, hold on a second, is that so much better for them? Actually, I don't think there's a reason to prefer their life to the one that you will have or could have. That's a bit philosophical. I hope that makes sense.
Well, philosophical but optimistic as well. But I wonder if maybe to temper that optimism, sadly, with this question of secular stagnation. And Carsten, maybe if I can come to you with this. Are we in a situation where growth is just low and there's not much we can do about it? You talked about the low interest rate environment. Some people think that has been led by central banks. Others think that central banks have simply followed, and that there are sort of huge factors across countries and over decades that inflation has been falling generally, growth has been falling generally. Maybe it's demographics, maybe all the low-hanging fruit has already been picked, maybe we're not innovating anymore, whatever it is. Are we in that grim scenario where the kind of growth that we got after the Second World War, and which let us deal with that huge debt pile that we had, just isn't going to happen?
I think the international sort of macroeconomic consensus is that there are things we can do about. We can do something about, in the U.S., both actually under Trump and now under Biden, you have a big fiscal push, and it is showing signs of increasing growth and also increasing expectations of future growth. So actually, on a sort of from an academic perspective, I think we have evidence that if we invest in the right parts of the economy, we can lift growth expectations. And on a slightly more figurative level or more visible level, I think we often think of post-World War II growth as like factories and expansion of the manufacturing sector, and that's probably not what, there will be manufacturing growth in the UK, but there's a lot of other areas that maybe we don't think about, like we need a revolution in how we live in our homes, in terms of how we use energy, how we produce energy, and that's a huge growth industry that people will pay money for, and growth in the end is providing services and goods that people pay money for. So there will be these new sectors in the green transition, in social and healthcare that are different from the growth in the past, but nonetheless they are valuable and they improve people's lives. And I should say there's of course the flip side to this, and this gets to the secular stagnation point, is It's services that people want to pay money for, but also services that people have purchasing power to take advantage of. And it was quite interesting. Michael Gove yesterday made like a big point about how leveling up can be good for growth and can be good for the economy. So having a less unequal society and having sort of money in people's pockets across the country actually also can increase overall growth. And finally, just an example of where the growth opportunities are. I was speaking to a colleague who's a GP in a hospital in Brighton, and he says he's still making all the notes with his patients on a piece of paper, and then at the end of the shift, he has to queue for a computer in order to type it in. And so this is a hospital in Brighton, so you see how investment there could free up productivity, increase productivity, and deliver better services.
So I'm really sorry to people whose questions I haven't got to yet. I apologize for that, my failing as a chair. But hopefully, you'll agree that we've had a pretty interesting discussion. I just want to give each of our panelists, and perhaps if we go from my left to right, so ending with Jesse, very briefly, because we're right at the end of our time, just final reflections on this topic and big takeaways from the discussion we've had.
So I think my main thing to say would be that possibly I've been a bit mean to the Chancellor.
Just in case he's listening.
And
You can have a job, it's okay.
Ultimately, there is a real problem ahead of us in terms of the demand on the state for public services and the need to raise money for those services. While I've sort of said that I think it's broadly reasonable that the fiscal plans will be to balance the current budget and try and get debt falling, that is not going to be an easy thing to do. I wouldn't like to be the person who's in Rishi Sunak's shoes right now, having to try and deliver that.
Carsten, would you like to be in Rishi Sunak's shoes right now?
Absolutely, yeah. I think he was yesterday. He ended on we need to look forward and we need to, we're coming out of the pandemic. We need to think about the future, and I agree with him on that. I'm disappointed that he's not talking more about how to raise medium-term growth. And we discussed how medium-term growth can bring debt levels down. It can be, good for public finances. And I feel like we're still too much tinkering at the edges when it comes to raising growth. And so if I was in his shoes, I'd give a similar speech, but maybe put some more investment numbers on green and social investment.
Great, thank you. And Jesse, final word.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. I would say a very simple thing, which is, if you think about what are the components of growth, so my view is that they are capital and talent and energy. And capital, there's plenty of capital around at the moment, one way or another. There's a constraint on public capital. There's plenty of private capital. We're sloshing around in it. Talent is a very serious issue that we are, that we really need to attend to on a 20 or 30-year basis. And I don't just mean growing skills across the country. It's a central challenge of leveling up. I also mean, and I'm going to have some fun at my former colleagues in the city, but, how smart is it to have the most talented or many of the most talented people in our country going to work in banks and professional services firms? I want those people to be engineers, I want building stuff, entrepreneurs, building, creating. And I think, a world in which we had fewer financiers and more engineers would be a much greater UK world. And then energy is the point I made earlier about industrial spirit. We've got to find a way of shifting the norms and the expectations across the country, just raising that expectation of competitiveness and drive. And you can always tell, great entrepreneurs, and the same is true of ministers, tempo. How quickly are they actually getting through the stuff? Are they ABC? Are they always closing? And we need to find some way of increasing the tempo of the way in which we as a nation encourage people and nurture them and allow them to engage with the world. And if we do that, then I think growth automatically follows.
All right, well, that's all, folks. Please join me in thanking our panel for this great discussion.